Well, welcome back to the Not Yet Now podcast. One of my pet peeves, by the way, I'm always moving my glasses up. I've noticed as I went back and watched our episodes. I just did it. So
you see a little tape there, and you can get the full
I do,
on.
yeah, and I do like a weird twitch too. So I apologize in advance, but we try to keep this as raw as possible. But welcome back, Brandon.
Yeah, it's good to be back on. I got the boot one more time because of a lack of mics in the studio.
Well, we started with 2 mics, and then we upgraded to 3 because we wanted to include Jill in the discussion. And then the last podcast, we had Jordan and Vanessa on.
Which was great.
It was awesome.
Yes.
And there's way more to that story than we were
happy to step aside for them.
And that's so good. We have ordered a 4th mic, so we'll have the ability in the near future to have 4 on the show. But yeah, welcome back if you're listening. And I want to say, I love you guys, your interaction in the comments. And there were some really thought-provoking comments in the comment section on YouTube, which is where most of that's going down at. I don't think there's a way to do that on the Apple or Spotify, but maybe Spotify. Anyways, I was reading through them. I'm like, man, some of these comments are so thoughtful. There was a whole lot in there about having an embodied spirituality, which we're going to talk about a lot in this podcast. So, but I want to thank you guys for that and engaging with what we're talking about here. It really is encouraging, and I know a lot of people are encouraged by reading your comments. And I wanted to also, something that we've been getting a lot of emails on lately is some of you guys are wanting updates on what is going on here in the Valley after the hurricane. And so I thought we'd maybe spend a little bit, just tell you a quick update. Things are getting better.
Yeah.
But we have a very long recovery. Brandon, you're working on a lot of stuff, so maybe you can give a quick update because Brandon is full-time with the church, so he's kind of running point on a lot of this stuff. So maybe you can give our audience an update on kind of what's happening with recovery efforts.
Yeah, there's parts of it that just seem hopeless.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I mentioned before, just that the drive from my house to the church is just the way that the river is and the businesses that have just collapsed in. It's not even that the buildings are gone. The dirt that the buildings were on is gone. Mm-hmm. And it just seems like when is this ever going to get back or some semblance of normal? Still plastic and trash 20 foot high in the trees. We had a big heavy construction crew from the eastern part of the state come in, and they were working at a local Christian school. And in 6 hours, they pulled 25 cars out of the river and the ditches just right around the school. And so those kind of things, it makes you seem like, how are we ever going to overcome this? But then on the other side, the support and the people willing to help, it just keeps flowing in. Like one of the things that people who've ever been a part of a disaster say is the support's great for the first few weeks and then everyone kind of disappears and you're left to your own. And, we felt a little bit of that, but for the most part, people have stepped in for the long-term plan. So I'm going to leave from here to go meet with a group out of South Carolina that wants to help us rebuild. So we're rebuilding homes in this historic village called Beacon Village where the water was over the roofs of the house. So a local contractor, we got a missions organization out of Louisiana that's sending the money for the labor.
OneKingdom.org.
One Kingdom.
Contribute to that.
And then World Vision is supplying all of the material to do those, and they're taking more donations to. So that's for the 25 houses over there, and that effort's growing. And then on the other side of the river, the houses were completely destroyed. They're not there anymore. We've bulldozed them, and then we're going to rebuild those from the ground up. And so it's been really cool to get to know these families and serve them. And again, just show them the love of Jesus in this dark time.
Yeah, but there is a need still, so we would encourage you to give. I mean, some people are still living in tents. It's crazy that that's happening, but they are. And
they'd rather stay here locally in a tent than go find a hotel an hour away.
Yeah.
But there's just no long-term or
things are getting, the temperature's dropping. Yeah. We do have another organization that's building cabins for people, as Cabins for Christ.
Cabins for Christ.
Yeah, Devin, those guys are great. So there's a lot of good things happening. If you want to be involved too, you can always give to the church, which is Swan.Church, SWAN.Church.
And there's a drop down there for the disaster. It'll 100% will go straight to that.
Yeah, so thank you guys for asking about that. But today we're going to talk about something that I think it might be the most relevant and important cultural issue that we have right now in terms of like where is the biggest threat coming against the kingdom of God. Caveat that we do belong to a kingdom, the Bible says, that can't be shaken nor destroyed. So we don't want to, I never want to present it as if, oh my goodness, the kingdom of God is under a threat, and if we don't do what we're supposed to do, it's going to end. That's not going to happen. We do belong to a kingdom that can't be shaken nor destroyed, but I think God does give us kind of prophetic wisdom through Scripture and through just cultural nuance that we examine the philosophies of the world that set themselves up against the knowledge of God, and the Lord does want us to examine philosophies that would be adversarial to the kingdom.
Yeah, there's two errors on either side of that. The one error would say, this is such a big threat, I better get out there and fight, or this whole thing is going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And then we live out of fear, and we're constantly fighting because we're afraid of what's going to happen. But the other error is nothing can come against the kingdom, so I guess we'll just sit back.
Which is the tension of the name of the podcast,
Yes.
Not Yet Now. And what we're trying to embody before we get into this, because this is, I'm gonna give the term in a second here that I think it really is something we all need to be aware of. We need to study. We need to understand the threats, and we need to make sure that our philosophies line up with the truth of the gospel, and the truth of God's word, and the truth of who God is and his inner life and his triune nature. But what we want to do is we want to embody what I think Mark Sayers' term, because the name of the book that we read was called non-anxious presence. How do we speak the truth, but not in a way like what's so disruptive in culture right now is not for us to get on Facebook and Instagram and even this podcast. I mean, there is a way that I know how to do it, and maybe I've even participated in the past in my life, where we can give you the red meat, and it's just like, and it gets tons of eyeballs because we're tapping into an anger. But everybody's kind of doing that right now.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at your social media feed. And what we want to embody is something that truly is disruptive. And we would argue and believe, and Sayers talks about this, that to really be disruptive is to be a non-anxious presence.
Yeah, there's actually I'll have to find the video and maybe post it on the channel, but there's this video that circulated around on social media a while ago, and in the foreground is this guy shooting a TikTok video, and he's at a gym, and he's stacking dumbbells, and it's pretty impressive. He's probably got 6 dumbbells stacked on each side, and he climbs up it, balancing on them, and he does a handstand on top, and he starts doing push-ups. And you're like,
wow, that's
amazing. But in the background of the video is this 80-year-old man who's shooting free throws. And during the entire video, maybe a minute or 2 minutes long, while this guy's getting set up and he's climbing up, the guy's just shooting free throws, never misses. Not a single shot. And it's such a picture of, do you want to be the big flash in the pan?
Yeah.
Just get out there really loud for the moment.
That's good.
Or do you want to have the type of thought life and inner life of the guy in the background who has cultivated this free throw over the course of his 80-year life to where he's incredible at it, but he can just do it in this calm, steady way. And that's what we're after as we try to think about these issues. We're not just trying to make a splash on the internet. What we want to help ourselves and help our church and help the audience do is really cultivate that life that's going to persevere.
Which should manifest itself in a non-anxious presence. The Bible calls it a peace that surpasses all understanding. Jordan and Vanessa, particularly Vanessa, talked about it on the last podcast, which I love her story and their story because they don't come into the discussion with the Christianese that we grew up with. I mean, we know the Christian pop culture world. We know, we're like in the belly of the nuance of all that discussion and all the little things and little denominational differences and all that, all that stuff. And they come into the kingdom without any of that, I would call baggage. And so to hear her describe the peace of God that surpasses all understanding and what she has experienced was, I know that it resonated with a lot of the audience. If you haven't listened to that podcast, you need to go back to the last podcast and listen to it.
Well, the way they even came into our community from the first time we met them, they didn't show up with an angle. They weren't trying to prove themselves or argue for something. They simply came in and they were just honestly seeking what is true.
Yeah.
Where is life found? How do we make life better? And whatever the answer to that question is, we're open to. And that posture, I imagine, is how they've carried themselves their whole life. And it's why so many of their former friends and colleagues, or they're still friends, are asking the question, what have you guys found?
Yeah.
Like they're still in, they didn't turn on those people. They didn't turn them off. They experienced the type of people they were. And now that Jordan and Vanessa have come to Christ, there's so many people asking, I want in on that.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting how that's, their story, along with others in our church, that's been kind of the ethos that Christ has developed in our body. Which really kind of brings us to what I want us to discuss today, and this is going to be a 2-part series because it's a lot to unpack, and I want to really lay a solid foundation. But the word is epistemology, which is a big fancy word, which essentially means it's how do we know what we know, and in philosophy, it's a really important idea that is discussed and debated by philosophers throughout the ages. It's been debated by theologians throughout the ages. It really is an anchor for how we interact in the world. How do I know what I know? And how can I know this to be true? And I started looking at this years ago, but I mean, think about what that would mean, like with everything that's happening today.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so much more heightened because of the amount of information that's out there. I mean, you sit down, you go to work, you come home, you sit down, you try to make sense of, okay, what happened in the world today? Well, where do you go? You turn on maybe Fox News, maybe you look at CNN, MSNBC, then you get on Twitter, then you get on Instagram, and you're just inundated with all of these ideas and quote unquote facts. And the question is, how do you sift through that? How do you make sense? What is actually true? Is there something that's actually true, or are all these ideas just constructed? Well, we're making them up as we go.
Yeah, we were just having this conversation about our personal business here and how much data that we have accumulated through. When you do a video file, it's a lot. So we're having to talk about server updates and all that. But you think about the massive amount of data that's coming into an information, which that's what data is. It's information that's being flooded into the marketplace of ideas. Even this morning, as I was on Instagram, I saw a video pop up of Puff Daddy, and it was very scary what he was talking about. But the first thing that popped in my mind when I watched this, so I wanted to share it. Like, hey guys, this is my gut reaction was I need to share this with people. But what stopped me from sharing it? Well, one of the things that stopped me from sharing it was I thought, wait, this could be deep fake. And have you ever done that before? So I know that maybe someone has shared something on social media only to find out it was fake news. It was a deep fake video. It wasn't the actual person. Maybe it was from a satirical site like the Babylon Bee or the Onion, and somebody didn't know that was a satirical site, and so they share this story, or maybe it's straight up fake news. And I mean, my family. I mean, I can tell you how many times. I cannot tell you how many times that the people like my Uncle Si has died. I mean, he has died many, many times on the internet, and those things get shared, their stories get shared, but they're not true necessarily. Yeah. And so how do we know what we know in this?
Well, even it's not an accident. That's the thing. Steve Bannon back in the 2016 election. So leading up to the first time that Trump got elected, Bannon was helping with, I don't know what his exact role was. He was political strategist for the campaign.
He was the chief. I think they invented a role for him. It was called, I think he was the CEO of the campaign. Anyways, go ahead.
So he was just speaking into, okay, how are we going to run this? How are we going to come against the media, which seems to be against us as Republicans? And he said, the Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with, and I'll clean it up, junk or crap. And basically, his strategy was just to put so much noise out there.
Yeah.
that it would just drown out the other noise of the media. So if people are saying something you don't like, instead of combating the actual substance of the argument, you just put a bunch more information out there, and then you lose sight of the other argument that's being made.
Which is to create chaos, and
Yes.
it's the opposite of being a non-anxious presence.
That's
and,
right.
And I would argue that that's very destructive. And no matter from the right or left, this isn't a partisan issue.
No. And it was short term, you could argue it was effective.
Yeah.
But long term, what's the results of a society that's just inundated with noise?
Well, and what they're calling us now, with because this was like I want to say pre-AI, at least where AI is today, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Now this is a real issue that now we have AI bots competing to flood the marketplace with information, because that's the marketplace through which other AI bots are creating creating information from. And so you see this kind of on steroids now. And this is going to I think there's going to be an exponential explosion of this. That if you want to call it a singularity or what, but there's going to be how are we going to know in the future what is true? I mean, this is what Pilate asked Jesus, right? How truth? What is truth? And I think that the devil's always going to attack the foundation of truth and knowledge, because that is the way that God reveals himself. And so I wanted to tell you guys about, and I think we've talked about this before. I think I've talked to you about this. I listened to I'm a big Schaeffer guy. I love Francis Schaeffer. When it comes to epistemology, Schaeffer and then another theologian from Westminster Seminary, a guy named Cornelius Van Til, have been very instrumental in shaping. I've read their works, and particularly Schaeffer, because he writes in a much more palatable way to understand his teachings, but kind of the similar idea. But these guys have been very profound in my own life, and when I came across their work, I was just like, particularly Schaeffer at first, I was like, wow. This is because I felt this tension. We were talking, everyone was talking about postmodern culture, which is that truth is relative. You have your truth, I have my truth. Now you would say it's my lived experience, or it's time for me to tell my truth, as if truth is not something that's outside of ourselves, but truth is actually in us. We determine it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. That never made sense to me, but I didn't really have a framework to articulate what that was. And I came across a sermon by Francis Schaeffer. I don't know where I tried to find it. So I'm going to paraphrase what he said. I think the sermon was given at some point in the early 80s. What he said there was a moment about 300 years ago, or I say a cultural moment that happened around 300 years ago in the German universities, where they became progressively liberal, and not politically liberal, but theologically liberal. But it all started in the departments of science, and they became overwhelmingly naturalistic. And the way that I would define naturalistic would mean that the world, the universe, is a closed system. So just think about the universe, draw a circle around the entire physical universe. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. It is a closed system. All that exists is the natural world, thus a naturalistic understanding or framework of the universe.
Yeah, and in that, everything can be explained by science. So everything can be explained by some experiment about the way one physical thing and another physical thing interacts with one another.
Yeah, it's all a chain of physical reactions. So think about when you pour vinegar into a glass that has baking soda in it. Like what happens? There's a chemical reaction, and there's a fizz, and I don't know the physiology behind it all, but there's a chemical reaction there. That's the universe. And up until this point in history, this really wasn't the way science had operated. It was science. I mean, Copernicus, Galileo, these guys were coming out of the Catholic Church. Now, to be fair, they were persecuted for discovering that, heliocentrism, and they were persecuted for that. They were called heretics. I think I don't know if Schaeffer makes this point, but probably that was one of the reasons why the departments of science in the German universities at the time kind of revolted against an open system. So a closed system, everything that exists is natural, physical, it's all that exists is matter. And in an open system, you have a physical universe, but it's open. God can get in, God can get out, God can move around. It's open. It's open to the spiritual realm. But at this point in human history, in the German universities, they became overwhelmingly naturalistic, and as a result, eventually the departments of theology also followed suit. And at the time, this was kind of the intellectual hub of the world. And so, one of the things that happened as a result of this was that the philosophers began to absorb what was going on in the departments of science, and they said, well, "Hey, hold on, guys, we have a couple issues here. If we are going to remain in the vein of reason." If we are going to remain in the vein of reason, then there's a problem with what you're saying. The first problem is that we don't matter, which is a big problem. Mm-hmm. If all that exists is the material world and there's nothing outside the material world, then all we are is matter. All Zach Dasher and all that Brandon Hudson really are is we're just a collection of molecules and atoms, just like this cup of coffee I hold in my hand. There's nothing in us to give us any real intrinsic value over a piece of trash. And so there's no basis for the value of humanity.
Yeah, and just like the chemical reactions you talked about, the way things in the world interact with one another, all of our thoughts, all of our actions, all of our feelings, they're nothing more
than physical reactions.
It's basically something was hit. The play button was hit a long time ago, and everything's just playing out. Yeah. And it's going to happen the way it's going to happen no matter what.
Everything is determined by a prior state of physical events, which is the second problem, by the way. The second problem, which was maybe more troublesome for them if they were to remain in the vein of reason, and that's a big caveat, if they were going to remain in the vein of reason, of rational thought, then we have to admit that we don't matter. And then the second thing we have to say is that we don't actually have free will. Mm-hmm. We can't determine anything. There's no acquiring of knowledge. Every thought that you have, it's not a thought. It's a result of a prior state of physical events. For example, going back to the baking soda analogy with the vinegar, if you pour the red wine vinegar into the baking soda, there's no decision that's being made inside that cup where the baking soda says, you know what? Now that we're together, let me create let me do this thing here. And they're talking about it. And they're like, you know what? Let's decide. That's not how it just happens. It is a result of a prior state of physical events. And so in the same way, if the world is simply naturalistic and all that exists is matter, one, we don't matter. And two, we don't determine anything, which you can see the problem because you just determine these things. Yeah. And so there's an issue there. So if in order to remain in the vein of reason, the philosophers said we have to do one of two things. We have to become complete nihilist, which we
talked about a little bit before.
Yeah, just
nothing matters.
Nothing matters. I think there's a song on that, right? Metallica. Nothing matters.
Nothing else matters.
Yeah, I got to go back and read the lyrics.
Is that the point of that song?
I don't know, but it was from the 90s, and the 90s are full of nihilism. Nihilism, nothing matters at all. There's no point to human existence. And we don't have free will. And I mean, Schaeffer would argue that basically kill yourself.
Yeah. And very few people live that out to its logical conclusion.
Yes.
Like there's something put into us, we would argue, by the Creator that doesn't allow ourselves to fully resolve itself.
But some people do. I mean, I think Van Gogh and others went to the end of their what's called existentialism, what Schaeffer called existentialism, which we would now probably call postmodernity. But it's this idea. Well, I'll get there because I think it's where we landed. But the option is to remain in the vein of reason. The option is become a nihilist or admit that God is there. Mm-hmm. But you don't have any other option if you are to remain in the vein of reason. We got to become nihilists and kill ourselves, or we have to admit that God is there. And I know this is you might say this is an oversimplification, and perhaps it is, but I think the point remains that really if you boil it down, I can't come up with another option if we are to remain in the vein of reason. And what Schaeffer argues is that they did the unthinkable, as he would say. They did something that the philosophers, that had never been considered in all of human history. They did the unthinkable, and they chose to abandon reason. They just said, well, let's just abandon reason then. Let's just escape from reason. which is the title of his book. Let's escape from reason, and we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. We can abandon rationality, we can abandon reason, and then they split the field of knowledge into two categories, into the subjective and the objective realm. Mm-hmm. How would you define that, by the way, the difference between subjective and objective?
Well, going back to Schaeffer, he talks about the two stories in the house.
Yeah.
And so on the ground level, he puts the objective facts. So these are the things that are observable and testable. So the things that science can speak to. So just like the experiment, if we do this, we know it's going to happen. How do we know all of the things? Well, we can test them. And so this is math.
These are knowable things.
2 + 2 = 4 every single time. So we put that on this lower story of our house that we're building our lives on. And basically in the way we view it, these are the things that quote unquote matter. And then up on the second story of the house is subjective. I can hold one thing, you can hold another. They can be completely opposite. I can hold that there's one God, you can hold that there's 1,000. The guy over there can hold that there's no God at all. And it's okay. It doesn't matter if they conflict and they don't make any sense together, because they're just like emotions. They kind of come and go, and nobody can really know it, and it doesn't really matter because we have these real things down here that we're actually living our lives based on.
Yeah, that's good. William Lane Craig defined it as objective truth would be it's true independent of my perception of it. So it doesn't matter how I perceive it or what I want it to be. It's true regardless of my perception or experience of it. And the subjective truth is subject to my own interpretation, my own opinion. It's more of I heard one apologist talk about starburst, and he had like a jar of like 150 different colored starburst. Mm-hmm. And he asked the audience, what's the best flavor? Well, I think the pink is, you think the red. We vote on it. Well, that's a subjective truth. It's subject to your own personal preference or taste, right? Now, but if I ask you, well, how many are in the jar? Well, I feel like there's 172. And you say, well, I feel like there's 141. Well, it doesn't really matter at that point what we perceive or what we want to be true. Man, I really want there to be 180. Well, it doesn't matter. There's 150. We counted them. And so that kind of that idea of the difference between the two. And what happened is they separated this field of knowledge, as you mentioned, and in that lower story was science, scientific facts, mathematical equations. These are things that we can know to be true. And then the upper story was faith, values, the things that we want to be true for us. And that had never been a reality.
Yeah, the things that used to be at the center, the discussions of God and virtue and what makes us human, all of those things used to sit here, and then everything else like math and science served that as the highest good. This was moved out of the center and put in its place was ultimately ourselves.
Yeah.
We became the center of reality. And so it leads to this other idea in philosophy. And again, I know these are big words, but they carry so much with them, is the correspondence theory of truth versus the coherence theory of truth.
Yeah.
And this is, if you get these ideas, then you'll be able to go back into the discussions about what's true on the internet and sitting around with your family and friends, and you'll be so much more equipped to have those conversations. So the correspondence theory of truth is what it sounds like. Truth corresponds to something. It's true because it ties to something that's true. And so what it does is it takes truth from being something that we have to construct and hold on to, and it situates itself outside of us.
Yes, I've heard it said this way, that the correspondence theory of truth is when my thought matches up with what's reality.
Yeah.
And the relationship between that. So if I have a thought that it's raining outside, and I walk outside and it's not raining, if you say, hey, Zach, it's raining outside, I have a thought now.
Yep.
I peek out the window, I'm like, okay, thought it's raining, look out the window, it's not raining, that's not reality. Well, then that's not true because that didn't line up. Now, if I look out the window and it is raining, now my thought has matched reality, and the correlation, the correspondence between my thought life and what's real, when that corresponds and is accurate, then there's this thing called truth.
Yeah, Dallas Willard said, truth reveals reality, And then I love that he says reality can be described as what humans run into when we're wrong. And so we're running down our lives. We're living out our truth. But the problem is reality is sitting there and we come smack into it when we're wrong. So the classic example would be, I believe I can fly. So I climb up on the building, and my truth is that when I jump, I'm going to take off and just soar like an eagle. Reality is the ground sitting beneath you that you're going to smack into.
The law of gravity.
Very hard.
Have you seen the Key and Peele skit? There's one where, I forget, I think it was Peele was playing a football player, and they're interviewing him in the locker room at the end of the game. He's like, kids, you can do anything. Anything is possible. And it's like this motivational speech. If you want to fly, you can fly. No, seriously, go jump off a building. You can do it. I promise you, man, kids, anything is possible. And they're like, and he just keeps going over, and he goes like over the top. And then the next scene is he's at a press conference. I want to apologize to the 12 kids that jumped off a building. But it's kind of like this argumentum absurdum. He pushed it out through humor, but it's like, no, there are things that we are bound to. There is a reality that we're bound to. And what's interesting about Schaeffer's two-story house is that, well, the idea one is that you live in the bottom story, and you say that the top story isn't real, or it's subjective. But then what you do is you reach up onto the top story to bring down into the lower story to prove that the top story is subjective. For example, when we go back to the idea of free will, and we go back to the idea of our thought life, we determine that all things are determined by physics. We determine that. Think about that. No, hold on. How do I determine that all things are determined by a prior state of chemical or physical events? So I reach up here into this spiritual world about thought life, and I had a thought that there are no thoughts. So I have to use the things of God to prove that God isn't real. I mean, that's kind of the absurdity of it.
Yeah, I heard Jordan Peterson do this great thing on this. He said, we want to base our lives on science. We're scientific people that no longer need religion. But he said science is predicated on religion. And he listed out these 4 basic claims of science. One, you have to believe that there is truth. So to do science, you have to believe that there's something that is true.
Yeah.
That it can't be true today and not true tomorrow. So it has to be consistently true.
That's a metaphysical assumption that you have to make.
Yeah, you have to believe that truth is understandable. So not that only that it exists, but it's something that we can ascend and communicate and get our minds around. 3, you have to believe that understanding truth is good. That actually understanding that thing's better than not understanding it. Again, that's metaphysical. And then 4th, you have to believe that there is a thing that is good, meaning that there's something good and then there's something not good. And then how do you define those? Those all go outside of science, but they're the very assumptions that science builds everything it does on top of.
And you can't ultimately, I would say, in this, you can't escape any of this. That's the thing about it. Is you can't fully ever really escape it without, and Schaeffer talked about this. He said, part of the problem with an apologetic like his, he said, you have to be very careful with it. And I'm paraphrasing this. I don't know where he said it, although I've read almost everything he's written. But he talked about like when you're entering into this type of discussion with people who are existentialists, you have to be very careful, because if you deconstruct postmodernity or existentialism, which is this escape from reason, if you deconstruct that for people, then if you don't reconstruct with the truth of who God is, then they're back in that dilemma of remaining in the vein of reason, which is to basically kill yourself or admit that God is there. So there's a real repercussion as we uncover this to show people, as we're having these discussions with people, like we got to be careful, because this can lead to a crisis like what many people, and artists and some of the most intellectual people among us throughout history have come to the conclusion and ended their life over this.
But even if you say there's something true, but it's the coherence, it's what I want to construct, it's my truth. The problem with that is we have to artificially manipulate our environment to always line up with these statements that we're making. And so I have to control the friends that I hang out with, Because if they say something that disagrees with this thing that I've constructed, the whole thing may come tumbling down. I have to, and so we talked about Thanksgiving, and are we going to go to our friends, our families for Thanksgiving? That was the big debate. Well, if I'm always just making up truth for myself and trying to create a system, then yeah, it may make sense for me to exclude my family. Because if they're going to challenge this thing that's so core to me, then I better stay away from them, because it will literally shatter my life if they challenge it. But if it's a correspondence theory of truth, meaning there's a truth outside of me, not one that I create, it's actually something bigger that we can all fall into. And so me being around others becomes a conversation to push all of us out towards what is actually true, not each of us trying to defend what we want to kind of build for ourselves.
That's good. Yeah, I think we tend to create unneeded and dangerous and destructive loyalties to systems and doctrines that are part of a groupthink, right?
Yeah, I mean, here's an example. If I were to tell you the sky is purple, we're sitting in a room right now that you can't see outside at all. How do I make sure that I always convince you that the sky is purple? Well, the one thing I can't do is let you go outside. Maybe on a cloudy day, and then I say, well, it's purple above the clouds. But if you ever go outside on a clear blue day, you're going to quickly realize that's not true. And so you look at the way that so many people live their lives in our culture, that's what they're doing. On a broad societal level, they come up with these ideas and these ideologies that they hold to and that are popular for the moment, and then they have to build all of these structures and institutions and systems around just to prop it up.
Man, that's really good, and I think where we've arrived, and some of this is really cracking, and I'm glad I talk about this. I think we talked about this on a previous podcast, a cistern. Our humanistic cisterns that we have constructed, they're not holding. Mm-hmm. The secular utopian vision and promise is not delivering. That's a good thing. I'm thankful that it's cracking as it is, but we are in a different place than probably what Schaeffer, like how he saw it, in his, which I would say was prophetic. I mean, he was seeing something before it had fully infiltrated the pop culture of Western thought. In his two-story dichotomy, there was a lower story where there were knowable things, there such as mathematical facts and scientific equations, like these scientific truth. Like there was biology, there was physics, there was algebra. That was all in that lower story.
And a lot of the stuff in the upper story was still generally agreed upon, and so it didn't quite create the divisions.
It wasn't, yes, but now we live in a culture that even the things that were knowable in the past are unknowable, such as biology. Now, gender isn't determined by biology at all, and so your biological reality may not be your reality if you see it in a different way. Or even mathematics has been under assault as a byproduct of the Western patriarchy, and this is all it's not knowable anymore. And you say, man, what is behind all that? And I think we know what's behind it, but I think, well, why does this matter? When you live in a bifurcated truth, what's going to happen is you are going to feel at war with yourself. We would argue this is probably one of the anchor evils that rip the human spirit apart. It's someone in the comments of the last podcast with Jordan Vanessa had talked about this, that we've moved into a new form of Gnosticism, a disembodied spirituality. And I loved how he phrased that, but that's what we're experiencing now. Mm-hmm. Gnosticism meaning that the physical is bad and that the spiritual is good. And so now my physical body, I'm now at war with my physical body because it doesn't match what my spirituality says that I am.
Yeah, and so the question then becomes, do I receive truth as something outside of me, or do I have to create truth to bring meaning into the world? So is there a meaning and a truth that exists that I receive and then live into, what we would call revelation?
Yeah.
Or do I have to create it? That there is nothing here, and then it's just up to us to try to muster something up. And that really sits at the core of this idea of epistemology for Christians, is that we do believe that there is a creator God. When Jesus comes, and in John 14:6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What he's making a statement of is that before all of this, I am.
Yeah.
All of this flows out of who I am, and the only way that you're going to find peace and understanding and prosperity and flourishing and all the things that you want is to fall back into me, simply to receive from me. And so the pursuit, we talked about this before, the pursuit in our conversations isn't let me fight you because I got to protect what I'm holding on to. It's there is a reality. He has a name, Jesus, and we're going to seek him together. And wherever that brings us, I'm going to lay down some things that were wrong that I'm holding on to, and I'm going to press further into things that I've already discovered about him.
Yeah, which our term would be epistemological humility.
Yes.
And T.S. Eliot said that we develop systems for ourselves so that we don't have to be good. So even good men, even Christian men, I would argue this has been a very problematic issue for the church, is that we try to put everything into a system so that we don't have to be good. Give me the doctrine, give me the system, not to diminish systematic theology or systems or doctrines or any theology, but when that becomes the focal point, and even reality itself, if reality is not understood as a man who has a name, which is Jesus, the incarnation of the triune God, then we're going to fall flat every time. Which I'll say this to end this episode, but we're going to unpack this more in the next episode.
And get a lot more practical with social media and how we then have these conversations.
But I do want to say, so you said, okay, I think we can make a very solid case for why a humanistic epistemology is unattainable, because it can't be lived out. It contradicts itself. And so what is a good kind of framework to where we could say, how can we know anything to be true? And we're going to take a what's called a presuppositional approach, meaning that we're going to presuppose, and we've talked about this already in the podcast, some of these concepts will drip throughout. We are going to make a presupposition. And the reason why we're going to presuppose something coming into the argument or coming into the discussion or coming into the exploration is because we don't have the ability to not have a presupposition. Mm-hmm. Everybody is going to have a presupposition. If you were raised by imams in Iran, you are going to see the world in a particular kind of way because of the way that you were raised and because of the things that you were exposed to. If I was raised in the Bible Belt by a Southern Baptist preacher, I'm going to see the world in a particular kind of way because of the culture that I was raised in. So to act like we can come into any discussion completely objective and like we're free from all biases is we would argue, a form of arrogance, which we participated in, and probably continue to participate in on some level. But we want to strive to at least admit, no, we have presuppositions. Our presupposition and moving into the discussion is going to be this: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and incarnated in the one we call Jesus. Mm-hmm. We're presupposing that. We're putting that on the table. And so the way that we're going to, our filter that we're going to go through is we're going to say everybody can bring their presupposition to the table. Let's just be honest about what the presupposition is. And you bring yours, this is the one we're starting with. Everybody's got to start with something. And then what we're going to look at is which presupposition can be lived out. What can I actually live? Can I actually live like this is true? And does it contradict itself?
Yeah.
And that's the foundation right there.
Yeah, and it matters because you can't just say, why don't we all just get along and love? Who cares what you think? Who cares what you feel? Let's just love one another. It's because, going back to the Willard quote, reality is what you run into when you don't pursue what is actually true. Yeah. And so these ideas have consequences, devastating consequences on families, on societies, on individuals. You talked about the way nihilism leads to just utter despair and, in most cases, suicide. That's a consequence of an idea. So if we really want to love our neighbors, then we have to pursue what's actually true, because if not, it is going to lead to the destruction.
Yeah, and
mankind.
only by aligning with what is true can we actually live it out without contradiction. And if we can, and at the core of our worldview, our identity, the way we're approaching reality, if it's in a way that can't be lived out, and it's in a way that's a walking or living contradiction, that will have serious implications on our spiritual health. And so we would argue that, and we are pushing for this, that one of the foundations of a healthy spirituality and even a healthy body and an embodied spirituality is to align with what is real. And that what is real ultimately is the God who created us.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll come back next time, and we're going to dive into this in a deeper way, but that's part 1. So come back next Tuesday for part 2.